phones off or put them onto silent, please. And can I ask if any apologies have been received?
We've received apologies for absence from Assemblymember Devonish, for whom Assemblymember Arbor will be substituting.
Thank you very much. Just the next items on the agenda. We've got the declarations of interest. Can I ask members to note the list of officers on the report and ask if you have any additional interests to declare?
Noted.
Thank you. And item 3 is the summary list of actions. Can I ask the members to note the outstanding actions arising from previous meetings? So that's it. On to item 4, our main item for the day. Overcrowding in London's homes. We're looking particularly at the social and private rented sectors today. Can I welcome our guests? We have John Lumley, who is the Director of Regeneration from the London Borough of Hackney. We've got Amanda Amerford, who is the Senior Environmental Health Officer for the London Borough of Newham. We have IJ Onyechi, who is the Head of Lettings Resident Services at Peabody Housing Association. We have David Beach, who is the Head of Selective Licensing and Regulation from the London Borough of Waltham Forest. And finally, we have James Gleeson, who is here for the first part of our discussion. He's a Senior Policy Officer from the GLA Housing and Land team. So thank you for coming, everybody. We've been discussing overcrowding quite a lot in the context of the London Plan and the London Housing Strategy. And I think one of the first questions we have for James initially is about data. So can you outline for us what the available data tells us about overcrowding in London and any recent trends that we should know about?
Okay. The first thing to say is that there's no single widely accepted measure of overcrowding. We have a number of different measures, each of which has its own strengths and weaknesses, and that's for a number of reasons. Probably the first reason is that measuring overcrowding always involves some measure of judgment, usually a comparison of the conditions that households live in with some sort of normative threshold that we think is acceptable, or and beyond which a crowding is unacceptable. The second reason is that it's very hard to measure, because to know whether a household is overcrowded, you have to understand the characteristics of that household, and also the characteristics of the accommodation it has available to it. And that's not possible without either carrying out a direct inspection or surveying the household to ask them. And that's inherently expensive. And as a result, we have a mixture of data from the census, which is carried out every 10 years and covers every household in the country, and sample surveys like the English Housing Survey, which is carried out every year, but only interviews a sample of households. Broadly speaking, there are 4 measures of overcrowding that are used. One of them is the statutory measure of overcrowding, but actually it isn't really used to measure overcrowding, strangely enough. It was introduced in 1935, and even then it was considered by some to be inadequate or too generous. Without going into too much detail, but I can if you like, it involves 2 standards. The first is the room standard, which is basically breached if 2 people of opposite sexes who are not living together, as husband and wife, have to sleep in the same room. However, children under 10 are not taken into account, and living rooms and kitchens can be treated as available sleeping accommodation. There's also the space standard, which specifies the maximum number of people who can sleep in a dwelling according to the number of rooms available and the floor area of each room. And babies under 1 year don't count at all, and children under 10 count for half a person. Count for half a person.
For half a person.
Yeah. And there's a sort of complex formula used to assess whether the that standard is breached. as I say, that statutory definition isn't actually used these days to sort of estimate levels of overcrowding. The last time it was used, or the last estimate I'm aware of, was in the late 90s, when the then government estimated there was around 25,000 households overcrowded in England, according to that definition.
Any, sir?
25,000. So it shows you how tight that is.
25,000. Chair, through you, can I ask, could you just speak up a little bit?
Okay.
I'm going to say that, is your computer blocking maybe the view of the microphone
muffled
on your left a bit?
You're on the left, I
They're
should
quite
say?
directional, but even so, it's probably picking you up a bit. That's better, thank you.
Better? Okay, I'll try and speak up as well.
That's much better. Thank you.
The second definition I
Oh,
mentioned.
that's so much better.
The second definition I would mention is from the census, and it's quite simple. It basically divides the number of people in a household by the number of rooms available to it, and calculates the number of persons per room. And bathrooms, toilets, halls and landings and storage spaces are excluded from the count of rooms. And households with more than one persons per room are counted as overcrowded, and households with more than 1.5 persons per room are considered to be severely overcrowded. It's quite a simple measure, and the good thing about it is that it's available over a long stretch of time. So we have estimates going back to 1931 in London, and it's also available down to very small geographical areas, as you can look at overcrowding in an individual neighbourhood. The disadvantage is obviously that the census is only carried out every 10 years.
Yeah.
The next one won't be carried out in 2021, and we won't have results until probably late 2022, I'd say. And it's the only source of information on sub-regional overcrowding levels that we have. The next measure is one that is used quite widely at the moment, and it's called the bedroom standard. And it was developed in the 1960s for use in household surveys by the government. And what it does is it calculates the number of bedrooms required by each household according to the composition of that household and the relationships between the people in it. So it says that a separate bedroom is required for every married or cohabiting couple, anyone else aged 21 or above, each pair of adolescents aged 10 to 20 of the same sex, each pair of children under 10, whether they're of the same sex or not, and then any unpaired person aged 10 to 20, unless they can be paired with a child under 10 of the same sex. Sorry, this is all probably too much detail. But anyway, it compares that number of bedrooms required to the... Sorry?
Sorry, the question was well, where do babies come into that?
So any...
Maybe half a person, or is it a whole person?
No, it's a whole person in this case. Which is,
And is it counted as being with its mother or parent?
as far as I can tell, it's counted separately.
Do they have to share a bedroom
Not as
if they're
far as I
under
know.
one?
Any child under 10 can share a bedroom with another child under 10 of the same sex, or, any child under 10 can share a bedroom with another child or with an adolescent of the same sex, aged 10 to 20. But babies are not expected to be able to share bedrooms with parents.
They're not?
They're not, yeah.
Okay, because it's...
Maybe in practice there's some flexibility on this, I don't know. Or some parents might not.
I thought if they were under one, they weren't counted, so to speak. But I might
check
have got
that
this
out.
wrong.
Well, I can check that out. Get back to you.
We can follow up with some questions
Yeah.
at the end. You were going to go through 4 different measures. Are you? The bedroom standard is the third one.
Bedroom
Is there another
standard is
one to
the
come?
third one. Yeah, there's one
Yeah.
to go. The last one is called the Occupancy Rating, and the Office of National Statistics developed that for use in the census. Basically because there's a final detail on the bedroom standard that I didn't mention, which is that any bedroom with a floor area of less than 50 square feet, so quite small,
Square feet.
is discounted, is not included in the count of bedrooms. The census has never collected any information on the size of rooms, and so you can't use the bedroom standard on census data. So what the Office for National Statistics did was come up with their own formula, which is quite similar to the bedroom standard, but which doesn't have this extra clause, basically. So it gives you a different number of overcrowded households. And again, it's obviously only available every 10 years. And that's
Great. Can I ask your opinion then on all that different data? You sort of outlined what's collected when. How useful is it? And can you tell us a little bit more about the English Housing Survey and how that's used? I believe that's what the Mayor's been using.
Yes, that's what we mainly use to measure overcrowding, especially when we're between censuses, as we are now. I would say the bedroom standard is particularly useful, mainly because it can be measured from the English Housing Survey, which collects a lot of other detail about households and the homes they live in. So, for example, we can compare overcrowding rates for households of different sizes. Unsurprisingly, they're higher for larger households. We can compare overcrowding rates by ethnicity. So we know that, for example, B&E households tend to have higher overcrowding rates in London. And we can look at the relationship between overcrowding and income. And again, there's a very strong relationship.
What's the sample size for the English Housing Survey for London in that much detail?
It is in the region of 2,000 households a year.
But within that, you can tell us age, ethnicity, and tenure. I've seen an age and tenure split actually at one point.
Yes, it obviously becomes less reliable as you dig down. But what we do is we combine the most recent 3 years of data. So that effectively gives you a sample of 6,000.
Yeah. Okay. Andrew, you have more questions?
Yes, please. The most recent English housing survey data actually shows a decline in overcrowding in the rented sectors. Does this reflect, first of all, your understanding of the data, Mr. Gleeson, and then if for our guests, whether or not that's your experience? So, Mr. Gleeson, does that reflect the stats that you're seeing?
Yes, so we've seen a little bit of a decline from the peaks in overcrowding that we're seeing in, I think, 2010-11. I mean, not a very big decline, and we're still higher in terms of the overall overcrowding rate in social housing and in private renting than, say, 20 years ago. So in 1995-96, 10% of households in London were overcrowded, of social renting households in London were overcrowded according to the bedroom standard. Now it's about 13%. And there's been a really significant increase in overcrowding in the private rented sector, from about 6% to about 11% over that period. So even though we've seen a bit of a decrease in the last couple of years, and I would stress that is at the London-wide level, so there's probably been increases and decreases in different parts of London, we're still higher than we were 20 years ago.
Did that increase in private rented accommodation go down to the fact that there's more dependency upon private rented accommodation, or are we to see it actually worsening in private rented accommodation?
It's actually worsening in private rented sector, so it's gone up as a percentage of the total private rented sector, even though the sector as a whole has been growing.
And can I ask the other guests if that's your experience, is that there may have been a gentle decline or a slight decline since 2011? Is that the case? Mr. Lumley?
I think it's very hard to say with any degree of certainty for some of the reasons we've just touched upon, which is the difficulty with establishing reliable data set. I think the other big point to bear in mind is that none of those data sets will give you an indication of the level of hidden homelessness that is in place. So the amount of informal sharing, the amount of reliance on ad hoc arrangements that aren't tracked in that sort of formal way in our anecdotal experience is increasing. So that would paint a very different picture.
Yeah, of course, as a committee, we're quite recently familiar with the hidden homes subject we just published a report on. Ms. Ammerford, do you see a decline?
No, I don't see a decline because many of my main duties are to carry out inspections in the private rented sector as regard to license conditions. And from my experience over the past 5 years, there has not been a decrease. It keeps increasing. Now we are finding 50 to 20 tenants residing in a 3-bedroom property. But with the introduction of licensing, we are able to target these properties and take enforcement action to ensure that the landlords comply with their license conditions and don't allow their properties to be overcrowded.
But you are seeing, you would say that you're seeing an increase of overcrowding. And Ms. Onyechi, what about yourself in Peabody?
For Peabody, I can't say that there has been a decline, or yes, I wouldn't say there's been a decline. What I would say is that for those that are overcrowded, there isn't a willingness to move, even where stock has been identified. And it's very difficult to actually find where to move them to, because the homes that are being built we don't have a lot of 3 beds or 4 beds or 5 beds. Exactly. There hasn't been a decline. And I think for some people, they're on the waiting list, they're made offers and they're taken off. And
I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but just to clarify what you said, you're saying that the 3 and 4 beds are not being built, is that correct? I don't want to...
They're not, because I manage lettings and rehousing, and I have the opportunity to see new developments that have come in. With all the new developments that are coming in, there seems to be a higher proportion of 1 and 2 bedrooms as opposed to 3 and 4 in the pipeline. So that, for me, I then wonder, if you house the 1 and 2 beds now, 5, 7 years down the line, their household makeup increase, where are you going to move them to? So that's just a personal observation, looking at what it is that we manage and the stock that we have.
Thank you for that. Mr. Beach, did you show your experience similar?
I think the other angle on this is houses let out of multiple occupation. It's not really touched upon here, but I think that really is putting a squeeze on 3, 4, 5 bedroom properties, because I think that obviously leads to overcrowding as well. Lots of problem with things like rent-to-rent scams, with subletting and that kind of thing. And obviously the standards we've talked about that James mentioned are mostly sort of spatial standards, but there's also the issue in terms of overcrowding in terms of amenities there. So, 10, 15 people in a property with just 1 kitchen and 1 bathroom and that kind of thing. So although Waltham Forest, as with Newham, have got quite restrictive policies in terms of HMO accommodation, we're finding that the problems of illegal HMOs is pretty well epidemic, really.
That's because it's a legal requirement for HMOs to register anyway, is that correct, all throughout London?
Yes, and have the necessary planning permission as well.
So when your experience is that much as there may be a decline, it's not been a massive one, and some people are actually experiencing an increase. So how do you measure overcrowding to inform your local policies with regard to that? Go reverse order, Mr. Beach. What should we do?
And again, I think James point touched upon it. It is quite difficult, and even the bedroom standard, for example, though the standard talks about sharing and so on, there's no actual, unlike the very outdated Part 10 overcrowding standard, there are no actual standards stipulated in the bedroom standard in terms of what a double bedroom looks like or what a single bedroom looks like, for example. So, and again, there's a further disconnection between our main enforcement tool in terms of overcrowding at the moment is probably our Part 1 housing health and safety rating system powers, and again, there's kind of different guidance on what we should do there, really. So I think it's something we do come across in terms of the inspection. I don't think we have any sort of definite figures on it, but I'd agree with my colleague from Newham that, you know, there's certainly evidence of it being a small problem. It is a big problem, really.
So, for example, when Peabody comes to talk about future bills and stuff, how do you measure the demand for large properties or to cope with overcrowding? How do you measure that?
In terms of measuring, for our residents, we use the bedroom standards. But when you talk about for future deals, for most new builds, 100% goes back to the local authority anyway. So any overcrowding within my current residence is not actually, it's not actually regarded. It's not important in terms of the build, the development and the builds that are happening. But when you're a Peabody tenant and you're housed and you become overcrowded, what we use is the bedroom standards, and our data shows that it's not, when you think of our general needs stock, which is about 41,000, we have about 6.7% of our homes overcrowded. And we have key boroughs, that we have high levels of overcrowding, and they're mostly the central boroughs. But going back to your question, in terms of councils and building, it doesn't really matter our internal data, because allocations will come from the borough, and it will be 100% of all the homes will be given back to the council to house people off their lists.
Okay. That's interesting. Actually, I'll come back to that on a later question.
Okay.
I find that allocation policy quite interesting. Ms. Amfor, if Newham councillors came to you and said, how overcrowded are we? How do you measure that and present that case? How do you...
I'm aware that they use what they call the index of multiple deprivations and system to measure that, but I'm not fully aware about the details of this, so we'll write to you about more details. And we also get other information from the data we collect from licensing. Through our licensing visits, we also make a note of how many properties we've visited and found to be overcrowded.
Okay.
And for future purposes, for our new licensing scheme, we intend to inspect all the properties that we are licensing, and in future that will give us a stronger data about what proportion of our properties in Newham, in the private sector, that are overcrowded.
That gives you a view of privately rented accommodation. What about in the housing stock itself?
Well, I believe in the housing stock they probably use this index multiple deprivation, but we can write to you about that. I don't have that information
That's fine.
on hand.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Lumley, in terms of Hackney, what kind of measure do you use?
Three parts to it. The first is using the census data as a baseline. We then supplement that with our own localised housing needs surveys carried out every few years. And then the third element is very similar to the point just made, which is we've just commissioned a comprehensive stock modelling exercise to underpin or to provide the evidence base for the proposed introduction of discretionary licensing schemes.
Do all you think, perhaps this should be Mr. Gleeson first, do you think a London-wide method for data collection would be useful in getting a clearer picture in the capital as a whole?
It's difficult to say because of the expense of carrying out this kind of survey. So Mr. Lumley mentioned surveys that Hackney do. I don't know how costly that is, but from my experience, for a single borough to carry out a survey with a big enough sample in their area to give reliable results is quite a significant expense. Right. So while it would be great to have that kind of data, it's difficult to say that it's the right way to spend that much money at this moment.
Right.
Can I ask, does the expense scale? I mean, is most of the expense organising it and planning it and hiring people to do it, or is it because there are quite intensive data collection methods involved that if you do more of it, it just costs more? Because we're trying to work out if there's economies of scale here, basically.
A little bit of economies of scale. So if it was a consistent questionnaire and if it was a consistent sampling method, then you'd get some economies of scale. And the sample that you need to give significant results at the London-wide level for each borough would be, well, it would be very large, sorry. I'm not going to try and estimate it. But really the expense is in carrying out the surveys. It's in paying people to go and survey households in their homes in the requisite level of detail. You need professional surveyors. It's not particularly fast. Response rates to surveys in London aren't super high. So you would need to go back to some addresses multiple times before you get a response. It's just inherently very expensive work.
Is that the methods used in Hackney? Is that?
Just in relation to the question in terms of would an accurate picture be helpful, I think there's probably a yes and a no answer. So,
great.
Yeah. So yes, a more accurate, a more detailed, a more up-to-date evidence base is helpful, particularly if you believe in evidence-based policy making, but also no, because to a certain extent we can probably tell you what that survey will say, and that survey will say there are lots of people who are overcrowded. So yes, that won't necessarily help. What will help is focusing on what the solutions might be to address that problem of overcrowding. So we can spend a lot of time getting into the nitty-gritty of exactly how many people are overcrowded and in what particular circumstances, but if the objective is to try and address that problem and to reduce levels of overcrowding, what we need to do is build more homes.
I was about to say you're preaching to the choir.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fully appreciate that.
We also want to scrutinise data.
Can I? So I can understand that there might be some drawbacks with trying to struggle to get a common standard, but there's no serious measure that says we aren't overcrowded, is there?
There's no what measure?
There's no serious measure out there or serious opinion saying actually we haven't got an overcrowding problem. No, there's nothing there. No detractors from that. Everybody agrees that, faulty though the evidence may be, there certainly isn't any evidence to suggest that there isn't a massive overcrowding problem. Is that fair to say? Great. Pleased to say that. Yeah.
Okay, do any of the other members have follow-up questions? I have one, but...
Yes.
No. Okay, my one question is, do any of you have a sense of where most of the overcrowding lies? I.e., is it families squashing into studios, one-beds, and smaller homes being squeezed at that end? Or is it more that bigger homes are filling up with maybe multiple families? Does that make sense? Do any of you have a sense of which side of things is the worst?
It's probably both, but I think the larger houses being used for multiple households is a significant problem, and I think, you know, if a landlord knows they can get an extra £1,000, £1,500 a month by letting out to multiple units, they're going to go down that route.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that area is under the control of the local authorities through planning policies.
It is. It's just the planning processes are so slow. Exactly. and you know, the thing is so fast moving. Just trying to keep, and it obviously it's very resource intensive enforcement wise as well.
Of course. Yeah.
What about in social housing?
Yeah, it's totally different because it's the smaller homes and through natural growth, and you know, that's how overcrowding occurs. So for my 1 bed, 2 beds, not as much as 3 beds, they're now overcrowded by 2 bedrooms and over, and they need bigger homes. So it is the smaller homes that, you know, they're growing, and there's nowhere to go to, really.
So can I just see if the others have anything to add to that?
As my colleagues have said, it's the bigger homes that are being used at Hmos that are more overcrowded. It's not just the renting of rooms, it's also the renting of bed spaces. So we have people coming in the morning and staying in the property during the day, and other people coming at night. So we've got that swap that is going on. And we may have a regulation of the HMO sector, but it's not just having the licensing scheme to regulate, but we need to go out there and actually see in the properties what's actually going on to be able to determine how to deal with it.
And Hackney?
So social rented homes remain the area where there is most overcrowding, but we are seeing a general shift over time towards increased levels of overcrowding in the private rented sector. And that's just because demand is increasing so rapidly. The sector doubled in size over the last 10 years.
It's your Hackney experience.
That's the Hackney experience.
Actually, it's private's more than social. That's interesting that there's that difference.
Yeah, and within the social rented sector, overcrowding disproportionately affects three main groups, and it's families with dependent children, it's lone parents, and it also disproportionately affects residents from BME backgrounds.
Thank you. Sorry, Assembly Member Gaffron.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, and I don't know who should answer this, but the London plan is to set the Hmos, well, the interpretation of the Hmos anyway, seems to be that we need more one-bed and two-bed flats, and that we are going to lose, and that, well, it's not only family housing that's going to be lost within the, or less family housing being built in the social rented sector, but also the presumption in favour of small sites allows for larger homes to be divided up. Now, I think it's predicated to a certain extent on the multiple households sharing larger family houses, being able to go into separate one and two bed flats. And I just wonder whether people have a view on that. Do you think those families that are sharing, or households that are sharing in larger properties, would, if the supply was available, but it's one and two bed supply, mainly one bed, do you think they would move out into and form smaller households in one bed flats or two bed flats?
It comes back to affordability, I would think.
Depends on the cost, depends on affordability.
Based on?
I say it depends on affordability and cost.
Affordability.
Yeah, it's the interrelationship between the current welfare reforms and housing affordability. So the extent to which residents are incentivised to downsize to a different property will depend on a case-by-case basis on how that affects their individual finances in relation to the benefit cap and their ability to claim the housing benefit element of universal credit and so on. So it's quite a complex calculation. So again, potentially unhelpful answer of possibly, but it will depend on a case-by-case basis.
I think from someone who deals with this on a day-to-day basis, the way to look at it is if a home is overcrowded and it's even if it's a large home and you're building 1 and 2 bedroom homes for people, then you're presupposing that the adult members, you'd have to be an adult member to be able to go to a 1-bed home, and you have to be able to afford it. So if you think of the fact that you could have, say, a couple with 5 children in a 2-bed home, and you're going to have to wait till the oldest child is about 21 or 25, can afford a home, can rent that home, and these are the homes you're building for those people. It doesn't, to my mind, it's not logical to say that you're building those homes so that these family members that are overcrowded now can move into those 1 and 2 bed homes.
Building the 1 and 2 bed homes.
Yes, but the 1 or 2 bed homes you're building for the families that are currently overcrowded, because most overcrowding for the social housing sector is from children, is from natural growth. So if you think about it, if I had I had 3 children and there were 7, 9, 10, and 11, I would have to wait how many years for one of them to get a job to then move into one of these 1 and 2 bed homes that we're hoping will ease overcrowding.
But sorry, is there another issue as well, which is, of course, let's say that happens, then that 21-year-old moves into a 1-bed flat, then they have children, and suddenly they're overcrowded. So where do they move to?
Exactly. So,
can I just ask one follow-up? Can I ask, it's Amy, it's Peabody, Amanda Peabody. Can I just ask, in those 1-bed flats you're talking about, that you said, that there aren't places for families there aren't the bigger flats for people to move into, or the houses. And you say there seems to be a preponderance of 1 and 2 bed being built. Who are the client group for the 1-bed?
That's a question that'll probably be best answered by the local authorities, because, like I said, every new build 100% of the homes that are new builds, unless there's a local lettings plan, will go back to the borough. So the housing need, as far as we understand it, is determined by the borough's housing needs and demand. So a local authority should tell you and say we need a preponderance of 1 and 2 beds because our transfer lists say that only 1 or 2 bed people need to be housed. So it's led from the local council, and they are the ones that will give you people, to accommodate those homes that have been built.
Because I asked the question because we were told at a previous meeting by London and Quadrant that the client group for 1-bed flat was a single parent with a child.
You see, and that's where registered providers are probably different. If we're looking at bedroom standards, a 1-bed flat for Peabody will not go to a single parent. We'll be looking for a 2-bed home for a single parent, like a lady with a child. We wouldn't give you a 1-bed because you're already starting to overcrowd before, with the first signing of the tenancy.
Fine, thank you.
This goes on to our next section.
Yes, I mean, talking about the way in which we're tackling overcrowding, it's a bit out of sorts, but I'll come back to you if I can, Ms. Onyesha, because of what you said about 100% of your allocation going to the local authority. This committee back in 2011 did a report about overcrowding. One of its recommendations is that social housing providers should be able first to sort out their internal mismatches before they then offer the vacancy, the void property to the local authority or to the housing waiting list. That sounds like you don't do that, and that it goes straight to the borough. Is that correct?
For new properties, so a new development has been built, a new Peabody development in a local authority, say in Westminster, 100% of all those homes will be offered to the local authority.
It's 100% of all voids?
No.
So if you do get a void...
But if we do get a void, depending on how the void was created, a percentage would go to the local authority and a percentage would be kept by us to administer our waiting lists.
Right, waiting lists. Yeah. Yes. And perhaps I should ask, I mean, does overcrowding have a priority within your allocations policy?
Right now, overcrowding is the 4th highest in priority on our allocation list. But to put that in a bit of context, we have 9 bands, and overcrowding is band 4. But we have 270 households in bands above overcrowding, and these are people that have presented themselves as overcrowded.
But there's 270 people above
overcrowding. The overcrowding band.
Vulnerable adults.
It would be your management transfers and your medical priority ones, and it will be your decants. So we have to move you due to statutory works or something. So those are the 3 bands above overcrowding.
That's first thing. And there's 270 people in those categories at the moment.
Yes, above.
You haven't got 270 vacant properties, have you?
No, we don't.
Right. Mr. Beach, could I ask whether or not you do allocate a priority in Waltham Forest with regard to overcrowding?
I don't really deal with the housing side of things, so
that's fine. And environmental health, we'll go to.
Yeah, I don't deal with social.
Mr. Lumley, do you allocate a priority to overcrowding?
Yes, we do.
And how does that? We've heard that it's quite high actually. Number 4 is high when you look at what's above it. How high is that priority compared to others?
So it's a points-based system.
Right.
So it depends on the other aspects of the household and whether or not they qualify under any of the other criteria that we have in our allocations and lettings policy.
Okay. Is there any kind of when you get a vacancy, avoid? Do you do an exercise of seeing who would, in your existing tenants, would best fit that void, or do you go straight to the housing waiting list to allocate?
We do two things. The first is that we do run a scheme prioritising or incentivising those who wish to downsize, and if there is nobody suitable that qualifies under that scheme, then we would, under our choice-based lettings policy, allocate the scheme to whomever is in the highest priority.
Of the waiting list?
Yeah.
And that waiting list would include people who are currently housed by yourself. So the waiting list can be your tenants.
Right.
Yeah. And has the priority changed in recent years, or has it remained quite the same?
I'm not aware of any significant or notable shifts in the last couple of years.
Okay. And this is an interesting question. May offend some people. I don't mean to. Do some people choose to be overcrowded? And if so, why? Anyone? Any takers?
So there are circumstances where households who are overcrowded choose not to move to an alternative property, and that's partly for the reasons that we touched upon earlier in terms of how that would affect their personal financial circumstances because of the way in which the alternative accommodation would interact with recent welfare reforms. I think a couple of other factors to consider are also the potential risk that their tenancy conditions may be altered as a result. So although we haven't had the statutory instrument laying regulations for fixed term tenancies under the Housing and Planning Act, there's a nervousness amongst residents in the social sector that might be introduced, and by moving from their existing property to an alternative property that might be more suitable for their needs in terms of the number of bedrooms available, they may have to accept a fixed term tenancy, which is less favourable. And the third element, I think, which is one which is much, much more difficult to evidence, but is the emotional attachment that residents have to their homes. And we made the point earlier on about evidence-based policy making, which is very important, but ultimately we shouldn't also underestimate the extent to which residents have an emotional attachment to their home, and that might influence their decision making in terms of whether or not they choose to accept the offer of an alternative property.
That's interesting that an emotional attachment to the home could override what most people realise is can be a very damaging environment for children to be brought up in it.
I think it applies more often in cases of those who are under-occupying, right, in terms of offers of alternative accommodation, and even where there are financial incentives attached, that can override that offer. But I think there are cases where it plays out in terms of overcrowding.
I'm sorry, yes, I misunderstood. So you're saying that's predominantly for people who are under-occupying, yes, and not moving, but they're not choosing to be overcrowded.
No.
They're choosing to be undercrowded. Fine. Ms. Onyechi, has your policy changed recently with regard to overcrowding, or has it remained the same?
No, with regards with overcrowding, that's why Peabody felt it's the fourth highest band really that you can get. But in reference to your question, I don't think people choose to be overcrowded, but people, when we try to move people, what we find that affordability is such a big issue for people, and you'll be surprised how the difference of even if it's because the rent values are not that different from a 2-bed to a 3-bed if you think about it, but £10 a week every week. And then the council tax bans if you're moving them out of the borough. Then the transportation to schools for their kids. So it's very little incremental things that when they add up, they're like, you know what, maybe we should wait. And again, for those that have grown-up children, sadly, there's that concept that when my adult son or daughter wants to move out, they're probably not even going to get priority with the local council. So if they're able to get a home, because we're overcrowded, because most of us now have schemes where to relieve your overcrowding, your adult child will be offered a home within our stocks just so that we can relieve your overcrowding. So you do have one or two people saying, well, my child is 16, if I wait 2-3 years, they would qualify for this scheme and they'll be housed and they wouldn't have to go via the local authority. So it's not a general opinion, but you also have a bit of that. And then local support and the network is such an integral part to people. And most of the time, the homes that are probably affordable are not necessarily within their local borough. So it's like, we'll just stay where we are and just, keep managing.
Of course, the arguments are that certainly in inner London, that's where you want building the 1- and 2-bedroom flat, I suppose. Miss Sam, sorry, Nikki, did you want to go?
Could I just ask, just following up from what you just said, if there were a family with this 16-year-old who's, would you give, when the 16-year-old was whatever age, I don't know, 19, 20, would you then offer them a 1-bed flat on the same estate?
Not on the same estate. I couldn't guarantee that. But we have, as part of our priority bands, we do have a scheme where, to relieve overcrowding, we will offer you your adult child a home.
Right. So whereas you were saying earlier that you're concerned by the 1 and 2 beds because it means you can't transfer overcrowded families into 3 or 4-bed flats, but you can alleviate some overcrowding.
Yes, but that is within our void, not within our new builds. I was talking about new developments.
I see, it's got to be void.
Yes, so if you're building new homes, we do need 1 and 2 beds, but let's not ignore the fact that the larger sized homes are also required. And I'm just saying that there has been, it appears a slight decline to the number of larger sized units that are coming through in the pipeline.
Yes, well, we sort of know why, I think.
Ms. Samafor, have you encountered people who are, choose to be overcrowded, or is there anything?
No, people I encounter, they don't choose to be overcrowded. They just find themselves in that situation where there's rising accommodation costs, which is not coping up with the amount of earnings the family brings in each week. So I've come across families, couples with 2 or 3 children residing in one room in a house in multiple occupations, basically because they can't afford even basically the 1-bed flat for them to probably be able to live comfortably. They find themselves in shared accommodation. There are also tenants who do not have recourse to public funds, so they cannot again seek assistance from the local authority to help them with any conducive accommodation.
Mr. Beach, have you encountered people?
I can't put in terms of people kind of deliberately overcrowd themselves, but they probably wouldn't recognise themselves, if I could put it that way. I think again it comes down to the economics and the affordability, and multiple families sharing the same properties just in terms of being able to afford the accommodation. I think that's something that has changed. I think in the private rented sector in the last 10-15 years. Whereas before it was very much single people saving up before they could afford accommodation. Now there are families, very regularly families trapped in, in accommodation. So I recently inspected a property with a family of 6 occupying 1 room, for example. So, I think that's just it's just the housing crisis where we are, really.
Like saying, I choose not to live in Chelsea. It's hardly a choice. Thank you.
Assembly Member Cooper.
I also choose not to live in Chelsea as well, but I have lived in South Chelsea.
Have you really?
South Chelsea?
Yeah. That's what.
Battersea. Is that the river?
That's right. See, the river gets in the way. No, it's Battersea to you. I know you're more familiar with St Wreatham. Enough of this London names game. I was really interested in what you were saying, John, that you think when the regulations are laid, that the fixed-term tenancies might actually act as a disincentive to people to move. Because I thought one of the reasons for introducing the fixed-term tenancies was possibly to try and assist with solving the problem of overcrowding, because a family would only then be in a particular location for 2 years and might then move somewhere to a more appropriately sized house. Do you not think that fixed-term tenancies would assist with dealing with overcrowding? And I'll ask that to any or all of you who'd like to answer on that.
So I understand the logic of fixed-term tenancies increasing the churn rate and therefore generating additional voids and so on. But there's firstly a question about whether or not it would be applied retrospectively, and then secondly there's that point about it acting as a disincentive to the individual tenant, so detached from that high-level objective, that means that tenants aren't going to choose to move from a home where they have a lifetime tenancy, paying a fixed level of rent, to an alternative tenancy where it may also involve changing the rent levels from target rents to affordable rents, for example. So actually the implementation of a policy which has a logic to it becomes very difficult in reality, or could become very difficult in reality.
Okay, I can see some nodding. A similar scheme, which was touted as this when it was being introduced, was the bedroom tax, or under-occupation charge, or whatever you might wish to call it. Has that had an impact on solving overcrowding? Have lots of people said, oh, I'm not getting that housing benefit for that extra bedroom, I must move from here immediately? In Hackney, for example.
No, we haven't seen any real evidence that has been
no exodus.
Been the motivator for people to move. No.
So basically, they've just taken the hit on their finances.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or they've fallen into arrears.
Or the council has taken the hit on its finances.
Yeah.
Is that the same in Waltham Forest and also? I don't know if you want to comment from the Peabody perspective on this.
Yeah, we moved about 168 people when it was introduced, and to date we've moved 168 households.
168,000 or just
no,
168?
I wish 168 households.
Not that big a large lot.
Yeah, that would have been. Yeah.
It's been in since 2013. You know.
Yeah, that's not a lot. And what we found in Peabody was that most people were tenants were quite happy to take the hit where they could. And again, for the homes that were freed up, we still go back to their locations, and you need to consider the boroughs and their housing list. So it doesn't necessarily always go to your own tenants who are overcrowded, and it goes to the local authorities. And going back to, I think, something that Andrew asked, Peabody operates in about over 24 London boroughs. And while everyone has points for overcrowding, I think from my experience, it's only K&C, Haringey, and Camden, I believe, that prioritize overcrowding as part of their allocation. So what we have coming in, and that's what I've seen from. So what we have coming in terms of our nominations are mostly statutory homeless. So if you think about it, even those that are classed as overcrowded on the council list, are they actually being prioritized for homes? I don't get the sense that they always are, that they're top of the list.
That's fascinating. So just so I'm clear in mind, apart from those three boroughs, the other ones you're talking to,
as far as I'm aware,
you don't get the feeling.
I don't get the feeling that overcrowding
is.
Are these boroughs that have recently changed their allocations policy? Because I know that Camden have
yes,
changed
and
it to do exactly that.
Yes, and Haringey did, and Kensington and Chelsea, obviously, I think was it last year or some time ago.
So as more councils change their allocations policies, they might.
They might, yeah. I know that there are points for overcrowding, but it's not overcrowding. The overcrowded household would not almost automatically get a home over a statutory homeless, which is understandable. But then you still have all those people there and with nowhere really to go to.
Would you agree that the under-occupation issue is probably more severe in people who are not impacted by the bedroom tax, in the sense that people who are pensioners are more likely perhaps to have suffered a bereavement and be living alone as a widow or widower, under occupying potentially a house that could be, or a flat that could be very suitable for another overcrowded family. Do you think there should be more done to try and, notwithstanding obviously the very deep emotional attachment, because people might have lived there for many years, what more could we do to persuade people who are perhaps under occupying by 2, even 3 bedrooms to move, freeing up that accommodation that would then be available for families that are deeply overcrowded?
It's like John said, that emotional attachment is really strong. So there are lots of incentives and, that have already, and they do find it really hard to move. And the point is, because most of demographics in this group have the real secure and assured tenancies, they don't have the fixed term tenancies, so you couldn't even with churn move them. The only thing that I would say, having walked my way up through housing, is maybe there was some sort of an incentive that was linked to maybe their children and getting homes for their kids. That would probably soon enough get them, to give up their home. So that might be that could be something to look at, because if you say give up this 6-bed home and I'll house your son, or I'll pay the stamp duty or the deposit for your son, something like that might, it might help.
You think so from the Hackney perspective?
Yes. I think I'd also add that
Just make clear that I am just here talking about that demographic, because Tom's right, wants to ask you about incentives for other people as well.
Yeah,
he was kicking me.
Absolutely. Well, this might answer both parts of the question and relates to financial incentives.
Yes.
So we do run a scheme offering financial incentives for those those who are under occupying, and they're very modest. I think there are 2 reasons why they're modest. First, that's just the nature of local authority budgets, and secondly, there is obviously a political consideration to offering households cash to move home, particularly when they're moving perhaps to a more suitable, or what some might describe as a nicer home. But actually, the reality of it is, if you set that against the cost of the provision or the need to provide temporary accommodation, it actually becomes a bit of a no-brainer. So, on average, placing a household in temporary accommodation in Hackney costs the authority, as opposed to placing them in a secure tenancy in a council property or tenancy in a housing association property, an extra £10,000 to £15,000 a year. So if we were able to offer more generous incentives, actually that equation would balance much more quickly, but that's not something that we're currently able or comfortable doing.
I believe that was the underlying ethos of the cash incentive and the tenant incentive schemes when they originally operated, but Thomas told me I'm not allowed to ask about those, because he's going to talk about that in a minute. I do want to talk to Amanda and David, though, about the private rented sector. And we know, and you've spoken about it eloquently, and particularly Newham, I think, is a fantastic scheme, by the way, licensing in Newham. But how can that help deal with overcrowding? And should some kind of licensing scheme like that, be the same across the whole of London, the Newham type of scheme?
Do I start off? Well, the licensing scheme has been able, through the license conditions, for authorities to be able to set maximum limits on a property, on the amount of people that should be in there and the amount of households that should be in there. So where that is not happening, then a breach of the license conditions has occurred. And where we have witnessed this, we've taken enforcement action. Now, the landlord also has a duty, or the license holder also has a duty to inspect their properties every 6 months to actually find out what is going on. And things that actually happen, which they might not know about, is probably subletting going on within the property, which will result in overcrowding. So in these kind of situations, if the license holder is inspecting their property, they should be able to be aware about what is going on and deal with it. They have various ways they could deal with it. They could ensure that subletting is not going on, or serve a Section 21 notice on the tenant, or take action to ensure that overcrowding doesn't take place. And that's the licensing bit. But we also carry out unannounced visits to these properties to actually where we suspect that it's overcrowded to actually visit and witness and take enforcement action on the license holder to deal with it.
David, is that the same that you found in Waltham Forest, that your licensing and regulation scheme in the private rented sector has been able to impact on overcrowding and to either keep it at bay or to reduce it?
No, I think we're obviously one of the few boroughs who again have got borough-wide licensing, following in Newham footsteps a couple of years behind, and I think it has been transformative in terms of having the resources and the insight and the intelligence to regulate conditions in the private rented sector, really. Obviously since we brought the scheme in, the political landscape has changed a bit. It's obviously much tougher now to get the redesignation in, but I know the Mayor has been quite keen on having the power delegated down possibly to the GLA in London to redesignate. We're obviously quite concerned about further barriers being put in the way in terms of being able to redesignate. And I think it's also been able to, obviously we've got the extra rogue landlord powers that have come in the Housing and Planning Act. I think we feel we're in a significantly better position to enforce those with the extra powers available through licensing to those boroughs who haven't got those powers available.
Do you think there are measures beyond licensing and beyond the rogue element that would be useful in terms of tackling overcrowding in the private rented sector? I'm offering you your opportunity to have 3 wishes, if you like.
I think the main legislation that we have to enforce is the Housing Act 2004. I don't think it will win many prizes for being the best piece of legislation ever enacted, really. I think the Part 1, our main enforcement powers are not great. Even licensing is quite a confused picture with a myriad of different schemes, complications in terms of HMO definitions and that kind of thing. Part 4 powers in terms of interim management orders are pretty toothless, really. So I think there is, I think there's a general need, to look at what tools are available under the Housing Planning Act. Yeah, there are some good things in there. Along with Newham, we were one of the first 2 boroughs to adopt the new civil penalty powers. We're using them extensively already, but again, the proof of the pudding will that be, we're relying on, there'll be a lot of appeals on that. We'll be going to the residential property tribunals for that. So again, will that be an effective power? We'll see.
Could you outline what that action is again? The civil penalty powers, which are what?
So basically, we've now got the power under the Housing and Planning Act for certain offences, and one of those includes breach of an overcrowding notice, for example, or breach of licence conditions, that we can issue a civil penalty of up to £30,000 as an alternative to a criminal prosecution.
Excellent. And they're still ongoing, aren't they? They're still ongoing, those appeals and everything?
We've just had our first 2 appeals in the tribunal this week, so we've got 5 or 6 weeks to wait for the decision. I think Newham had the first appeal through, and
we've had a number of appeals, and I think the recent one we had was for poor management of a shared accommodation, and we got about £22,500 as a financial penalty.
Not taking up too much time. Could you let us know how they've gone? If you could write to us and let us know what, because that would be interesting to know. Because one of the reasons we often hear is that local authorities don't really have the powers to act in many of these cases. And it would be great to hear how they can.
But I think in your cases, because you've got the licensing schemes in place, you're able to act. My understanding is that if you didn't have the licensing schemes in place, you would not be able to act because you couldn't enforce for breach of licence if there was no licensing scheme.
Yes.
Exactly. You've still got there's still some things you can issue civil penalties for, but the range of things you can deal with under licensing is much bigger. So the one we were in Monday was we were defending £45,000 worth of civil penalties we imposed on landlords for example, failing to provide smoke detectors in the property. They declared on the licence application there were smoke detectors there, so it's just basic safety measures, really.
Basic safety measures, but I think that, and I'm also a member of the London Fire Authority, I think we'd be looking to see you carrying on with that kind of enforcement. Is there anything, Amanda, that you'd like to add to what David was just saying, your 3 wishes, unless they're the same?
Yeah, licensing gives us the ability to actually know what is happening down there in the community and what type of setup, and then due to intelligence, because we don't work solely alone, we also work with the police, the immigration department and council tax. So we always have multi-agency working. We always do that, and we're able to gather intelligence. So even if we are not going to a particular property, if the police are going, they inform us of what's going on in that property. If the immigration officers have been to that property, they automatically tell us what they've seen. So we're always gathering intelligence and being aware about what is going on. So without licensing, I find it difficult how local authorities will be able to know what's going on in their area.
Whether you wanted to come in on that as well. Thank you very much, Amanda. That's really, really useful what you and David have been saying.
So I just think it's useful to be aware of what might potentially happen next. So Hackney is proposing to introduce both additional licensing for HMOs and selective licensing on a pilot basis to 3 wards later this year. That goes to Cabinet on Monday. So we are big supporters of licensing, and we want to see all the benefits that colleagues have just touched upon brought about. But the potential downside, I think, is twofold, generally speaking. The first is that licensing may result in some properties being taken out of rented stock because landlords don't want to remain in the sector, they don't want to sign up to a licence, or it's not possible to grant a licence because the property is in such a state of disrepair or whatever it might be. And then secondly, in relation to overcrowding specifically, it may be the case that in terms of enforcing that overcrowding criteria, some households will have to move out of the property, or some individuals may have to move out of the property. And the likelihood then is that they then present to the local authority as homeless, and there's a duty for us to house them, and we don't currently have anywhere to house them. So there are some potential downsides that we do need to be aware of. And so I draw that back to the question in terms of what my asks would be, and they relate to the point I made earlier, which is about that fundamental question of supply, because this is all part of a complex chain of how we try and address both the cause and the symptoms. The first would be additional lobbying to raise or abolish the HMO borrowing cap, and then secondly, additional financial assistance, preferably through the Mayor of London's grant programmes to assist with the provision of more genuinely affordable housing.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Gaffron, did you have a follow-up?
I think it's just been answered, because I was wanting to know what steps were in place to help those people who are then evicted or made homeless as a result of licensing. Because, you know, overcrowding, then, I mean, where are they to go? What happens to them? And you've sort of, I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to that.
I think, I don't disagree with your fellow panel members, but I think certainly when Newham's licensing scheme came in, I know that there was lots of concerns expressed about it would reduce the supply of PRS in the borough. And I think there's no evidence that actually occurred. And I think actually the level of PRS actually increased in Newham over the life of the scheme. I think I'm not aware really of any massive displacement. I think certainly in Waltham Forest, it's not my area. But I think that our current figure is that 53% of our homeless acceptances are just the end of an AST is the main cause of new acceptances now. But I don't think there's any suggestion that's through to any overzealous enforcement or any additional enforcement of the licensing scheme, really.
People, so where there's an overcrowded property, do you have evidence of what happens to the people who have to leave it?
I think they just find other accommodation. I think they don't necessarily present themselves as being homeless to the local authority.
Okay. All right. But they are very much, it's very much last resort, isn't it? I mean, being in very overcrowded, unfit homes. And I'm just wondering whether they have the wherewithal to find anywhere. I'm posing a question. I think there is a dark side to the licensing scheme. But I'm just wondering how we deal with it.
Yes. I mean, people in these overcrowded homes are not exactly undercharged for the privilege either, so maybe there are other options for them. What's this? Assembly Member Copley, we are moving on now to what the Mayor can do. I think you're leading off.
Thank you. Well, my first question, I mean, I think we could just go through each one of you, yes or no, really, on this one. Should the Mayor have a target to reduce overcrowding? Start with John.
Must I answer yes or no?
You don't have to, no. You can give us a different form of words if you'd like.
I don't think a target is unhelpful,
Okay.
but equally I don't think it should be the top priority.
Okay.
I
Amanda?
don't think you should set a target. If he sets a target, it might be very difficult to achieve. I don't see how setting a target will help him achieve that.
Isn't it sort of a point of that target, so they should stretch you?
No, it depends on what data he obtains, but I don't see how good that will be in setting a target. Because overcrowding data is not an easy data to collect. That's from my experience.
Okay.
Without saying a yes, I just think that housing, homes that are built should be according to housing needs in the borough. And housing needs in the borough should be really data driven. So you should be able to calculate how many of your applicants or tenants are overcrowded and ensure that supply within your borough meets the housing demand. So saying build more homes, for me it's good to build more homes, but you need to be clear about the people you're trying to house and build the homes for the people that you're trying to house, and not just within the council but also every registered provider or every social housing tenant that has those issues. So it should be driven by demand. So I don't know if the target helps, but you do have overcrowding. It might not be as high, but there is overcrowding, and your homes and your build should reflect that in some way.
Interesting one for us here, because we've seen what's come back in the Hmos on what apparently is needed, and it says mostly 1 and 2 beds. In fact, more than 50% of it being 1 beds across London, and yet most of the boroughs that we've spoken to, and we spoke to Havering, who said their need was 80% family homes. I think Tower Hamlets were saying they wanted majority family homes. So what's come back and what the mayor says doesn't seem to tally up with what's happening, with what's being seen within the boroughs and what they're reporting.
And that's what I found when I tried to, the Constitution on the London Action Plan, and I tried to read it, and I really couldn't understand it, because for somewhere like Haringey, when you nominate a 1-bed property, it's more difficult to find people to fill those homes. So, but if once a 3-bed or a 4-bed comes up, first viewing it's gone.
It's in.
So, and then for some of the Section 106s or the nomination agreements that have come through that I've had to review, I've actually had to challenge, and I say, can you go back to the allocations department of that council and find out what their demand is, their list? Because if they're agreeing to this, do they understand that they have more overcrowded applicants, or they have more applicants that need larger sized homes? Why are you building this? So the sense I have is that it's almost like the data in the boroughs are not, it's not being used properly to drive, housing need and demand within the boroughs.
It's very interesting. I'm wondering whether they even ask, when they're coming up with the data for the London Plan, I don't know if even they ask the boroughs where the demand is in terms of their waiting lists when they're coming up with these figures.
I don't hope that they do. Do you know?
I don't.
Councils.
I think.
John,
sorry, go on.
We've asked about should there be a target for overcrowding, which I suppose can be quite nebulous. But however, should there be a target for the size of homes that we're trying to build?
Should be. I would say yes to that. And this, like I said, is driven. It should be driven by data. And you should not just build 1, 2-bed homes in Islington when their local need shows that you need 3, 4-bed homes.
Can I move on to you, David? And do you think we need a target to reduce overcrowding and sort of commenting on what we've been talking about in terms of the need for different types of homes?
I think what Andrew was suggesting would make sense to me. Maybe looking at, I think, an aspirational target to reduce overcrowding, but if that's linked up with more targeted home building, that the two should go hand in glove, I think, really. Maybe a measure of the one of the measures of expanded house building or new dwellings should be an overall reduction in the level of overcrowding.
And John, what do you think? Do you think we need larger homes, and do you think that we need a target for larger homes?
I think those considerations are second order. So no to the first part. Do we need a target? Because we need more homes of every size. So if we take Hackney as an example, we have 13,000 people on the waiting list, 3,000 households in temporary accommodation. We've not got any particular type of home that we're struggling to fill. We can't build homes of any size fast enough to reduce either of those figures. So yes, in an ideal world, we'd have a perfect approach to data analysis that targeted all of the new homes that were brought forward and that aligned and correlated with all of the demand on the waiting list. But for the time being, we just need more homes. And no matter what size they are, we will be able to fill them because of the size of the demand that we have across the spectrum.
Is that your view, Amanda?
Well, I'm not so much versed in the social sector, but I believe we do come across properties were overcrowded by families as well as single persons, so it's across the sector.
Going back to the issue of larger homes, do you think they're effectively incentivised in the draft London plan? So, and indeed within the Affordable Homes Funding Programme, because you've got a fixed grant rate of 60k, whether it's a studio flat or a 5-bed. Do you think that creates a skew towards smaller properties?
Yes.
Okay, and so do you think it would be better for the mayor to offer perhaps a differential rate? So, the bigger the home, the bigger the grant. Is that a general view, David? Yeah. Is that your view as well? More flexibility in terms of that. Okay. I'm moving on to.
Can we ask if that would affect the housing targets?
It would affect the housing targets. Sure.
That would affect your housing targets in Hackney, wouldn't it? Because you'd be building more family homes, fewer 1 and 2 bed.
I think the general point about flexibility is the key one, which is that we want to build more homes and more homes of every size to meet a diverse range of needs. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it would drastically reduce the overall output. I think it would just be beneficial in terms of giving providers, not just the council, but RPs and other developers, the freedom they need to both benefit from that fixed grant rate, which is positive in many ways in terms of security of future income and business planning and so on, but also being able to deliver a range of products across a range of different schemes.
Have you done a recent local Hmos in Hackney?
Yes.
And what does that tell you in terms of where the need is in terms of number of bedrooms?
So I don't have all of the data to hand, unfortunately, and I think some of it is referenced in the report that you provided in advance of today. But what is particularly interesting is the contrast between the outputs of the Hmos and the evidence that is available in terms of the housing waiting list. So there is something of a divergence between the recommendations of the Hmos in terms of provision of larger homes, but the proportion of households who require smaller properties who are in the greatest numbers at the higher ends of the priority bandings on our waiting list. So again, it sort of goes back to one of the first things that we discussed about difficulties with data sets and getting consistency and so on. But I think also underpins that previous point about the fact that whichever way you cut it, we just need more homes of all sizes rather than getting fixated on one particular type of provision.
Although if you were to just build all 1-bedroom flats, then that would cause problems, surely.
Sure, and I'm not suggesting that, but I think fixating on one particular type in that way, but coming at it from a different perspective is equally unhelpful.
I think it's just more about ensuring that family-sized housing isn't disincentivised for the reasons that we've discussed already. Yes, of course.
Just very quickly on that, one of the things that postulations that we had in our report back in 2011 was that if you build a one-bedroom house, you're possibly only solving the housing needs of one particular person. If you build a 5-bedroom house, you're actually solving the needs of multiple families as people readjust to different sized homes, i.e. the churn in housing. Is that something that you recognise, and perhaps if Ms Onyekyi recognises as well, that the larger homes give you more choices and actually liberate the 1-bedroom, the 2-bedroom and the 3-bedroom as you allocate for people's needs?
Yes, absolutely. I think we just need to be aware of how that links to some of the other points we discussed earlier about how that translates into reality, the reality of people moving where they're either over-occupying or under-occupying.
Thank you.
I want to move back onto the downsizing, which of course Assembly Member Cooper has raised already. We've discussed this a bit, but I mean, the question is, how can the Mayor make downsizing more attractive in London? Are there things that the Mayor can do? Start with you, John.
So, I spoke earlier about financial incentives, and I think that's something that's worth investigating further and seeing whether or not there's any assistance that the Mayor can provide. It need not even be direct financial assistance, but assisting boroughs in doing the research and investigating potential options, potential policy initiatives that boroughs could pursue, and doing that on a pan-London basis I think would be very helpful, because boroughs acting in isolation, we all to a certain extent face the same challenges, so coordinating those efforts across London I think will be very helpful.
We still have the Seaside and Country Homes programme, of course,
I believe so,
which we run from the GLA, but I think the take-up is very, very low, and I'm not sure how many properties become available outside of London for people to go to, but perhaps there's something the Mayor could do to reinvigorate that scheme as well. And I like the suggestion about incentives in terms of family members being able to. I mean, that's also a way, of course, of which I think councils have used to get consent for development on existing estates by saying, well, these properties will be available either for you to downsize into or for your family, your children, that kind of thing.
Because for Peabody, we've done the financial incentives, and like John said, there's an emotional attachment, and we find that no matter how much money you actually throw at people, it's not at that the client group here. The money is good, but it's not a problem for them. If there's some sort of a gain for a family member, they tend to want to move easier. We've had cases where we had a particular case where a lady was in a 4-bed and had a son, and she said the only way I would move is if you gave my son a tenancy, a social tenancy, and I would happily move to a 1-bed, and that had to be signed off. But for us, it was, well, we're getting a 4-bed, so because she said rightly, because my son will not have priority if they were to approach any of the councils. So if there was some sort of a scheme that actually went to the depth of that, and what do they really want, and just when you think of the cost down the line, it makes better sense to do that than say I'm giving you 1,500 a room. They don't need that. They're happy to stay there.
Any more comments on downsizing and incentives to downsize? Anything else? Oh, Nikki, sorry, yes.
Just on downsizing, this is in the, just going back to what we were saying much earlier, that the presumption in favour of small sites does two things. It does many more things, but I'm just taking two. One is there's a potential of some infill sites becoming available because of the presumption. And secondly, the conversion, the presumption in favour of conversion counting as a small site. And also, I'm just thinking of people who are, and I just want to just put this perhaps to Hackney, because you probably do have quite a lot of large family houses in which people have space. I mean, we know that there are quite a lot of private, about 40% of all the 800,000 homes with 2 or more spare bedrooms are in the owner-occupied sector, and just whether there's some deal that boroughs can do, mainly with people who really would like to downsize from their owner-occupied houses, but don't have the income to be able to do it, so to speak, because it's quite expensive to just even the moving and so on, but also want some incentivisation, and they would, but only if they're in their own community. And I just wondered whether there couldn't be some incentives round this. Some way boroughs could sort of put some sites aside for people in order to help them to downsize, so you free up larger family houses, either for a big family or for dividing up into smaller households. Any ideas on that?
Is that from the owner-occupied sector into the social sector?
No, it's into the... No, it wasn't. It was into the private sector. It's something that boroughs might be able to do.
Owner-occupiers moving to other private properties.
A lot of under-occupation is in the home ownership sector.
Yep, absolutely.
And you know, these are under-occupied homes, and people might have the emotional attachment, and therefore but often the emotional attachment is to the area in which they live, into the community. But there's nowhere in the community for them to move to that they could, you know, that's there. There's always the supply. They probably could afford it with some assistance in moving and so on. But they could, because they'd be selling their main asset.
We don't have any planning officers with us today.
It's an idea.
But John, you're the director of Regeneration, which means you must be building some private sector homes alongside new social homes.
That's right. Yep.
Have you thought about the issues that Nikki has raised at all?
So the homes that we deliver that are not affordable are delivered really solely to generate the cross-subsidy required to fund social rent and shared ownership. We have recently made progress towards creating a wholly owned housing company, a subsidiary company to provide homes at living rent. And so I'm thinking about whether or not there is some relationship between the provision of a living rent product and that providing an incentive to those wishing to downsize. But that's something I'll probably need to give some more thought to.
I think we are, and the answer to your question, Nikki, I think is that we're at very early days with a lot of councils on this. But it is worth thinking about.
Yes.
I mean, the idea that people might move from owner-occupied into even affordable rent doesn't sound quite right either, does it? It's more to do with, presumably when you put together the plans for the private sale homes, you're doing that according to like a market study with the objective of making the most money rather than solving other problems within the borough, I would have thought.
Yeah, that's right. Those homes are built so that we can generate the subsidy required to fund the construction of the sector. That is their purpose. That's the purpose for delivering them. Whether or not there's a blend as part of that approach that could also tackle that particular issue, again, like I say, something probably worth giving some more thought to.
I think we'll need to get Savills in to talk to us about this. Andrew, do you have a final question?
I do actually. It's on downsizing. You know, I first became a local councillor in 1982, and we had an incentive scheme there, and we used to give people a couple of grand to downsize, and it kind of worked occasionally with some people, but never had the impact. If we came up with a scheme that got everybody who was under-occupying to go to a more appropriate sized property, would we solve overcrowding in London? Or in your borough even?
No.
Because they don't match.
It depends on individual circumstances, I believe.
I mean, are the numbers there? Are the numbers who are under-occupying greater than the numbers of people that are overcrowded?
I think two parts to explain why I don't know. One is I just don't have that analysis in front of me in terms of the available data. But I think more importantly, the very first thing that we discussed is that even if we could sit here with a spreadsheet and run the numbers, we probably don't have all of the information we need to give a confident answer.
So just relying, I mean, it's fair to say, is it not, just relying on downsizing is not an overall solution to overcrowding in London.
No, I believe that the focus should be on a combination of addressing that issue, but increasing supply.
Okay, thank you so much. That's very, very useful.
Thank you. There are numbers hidden away in the Hmos towards the end.
Yes.
But we will look at them before we decide what to do.
The Hmos, I like.
Within Newham,
Looking at the Hmos in the appendix, for each borough represented here, the biggest demand in terms of social rent is for 3 beds in each case. Now, of course, I'm not entirely certain when these were carried. All of these were carried out. They might have been carried out differently. They were probably done at different times, but still.
well, we'll need to finish that, I'm afraid. But thank you very much to our guests.
Yeah, really interesting.
This has been very interesting. We have a few more little formal bits of things on the agenda, which will take a couple of minutes, but you can leave there if you wish. On this item, can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion and agree to delegate authority to meet as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the discussion? Item 5 is our work programme. Can I ask the committee to note the progress on the work programme as set out in the report? We have a meeting later on this afternoon to discuss that further, so I hope it will come. Item 6 is the date of the next meeting. This is scheduled for the 24th of May at 2 p.m, subject to agreement at the Assembly's annual meeting. Item 7 is any other business, and I have no urgent business today. Thanks, everybody.
GLA, Chamber, Sound. 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 GLA, Chamber, Sound.